Great. Thank you for the introduction. So back to the regularly scheduled programming of foundation models. I'm going to be talking about data for robotic manipulation. And I'm really interested in this question of how we might allow robots to generalize to the real world. And one recipe that we've seen be quite successful for enabling generalization in the wild is to combine large expressive models with broad data sets. And I think we have generally seen we've seen successful recipes in terms of building large expressive models, and we sort of know how to build large expressive models. I think that the much bigger question in robotics right now is, where does the data come from? Should it be demonstration data? Should it be autonomously collected data? How is the data collected? Where is it collected? For what tasks? And so forth. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about where I think the data could come from. And I'll actually talk both about demonstrations and about autonomously collected data. And I think that a big part of the issue is that right now, a lot of robot learning research will, including a lot of my own research, will collect data for a project and then train a model using that data for the task that you want to show a proof of concept of your algorithm, and then publish your paper and so forth, and then don't use the data ever again, and do this for each and every project. And this is great for getting papers and I don't know, doing research, but it's also, I think, hindering our progress as a field. And if in contrast, you look at what machine learning research does, machine learning research usually curates a data set once, like ImageNet or Wikitext, reuses it many, many times, and doesn't have to recollect ImageNet for every single project that they do. Or even better, they don't even train on ImageNet. They'll just download a model pre-trained on ImageNet and reuse that model many times. And I think that if it was possible to share data and pre-trained models across institutions in robotics, I think we'd be able to make a lot more progress as a field if we did that compared to what our current paradigm is. So from that perspective, what's stopping us from sharing data across institutions? Well, I think that a big problem that we have right now is I think we can kind of think of the current landscape of data in robotic manipulation a lot like this, where each data set that exists is like an island in this really massive ocean. For example, maybe this is the bridge data set, the MIME data set, RoboTurk, RoboNet, and so on and so forth. And the tricky part here is that when you want to then run an experiment for a new project and show a robot doing something new, inevitably that's going to be somewhere out in the ocean, pretty far from all the islands of data. And likewise for the experiment after that. And because we're far from the existing data, this means that it's hard to reuse the data that already exists to solve a new problem. So I think this is a really tricky problem to overcome, and there's a kind of a really big hump in between the kind of current paradigm and the paradigm of actually reusing offline data from previous projects. But I do think there's a couple things that we can do about it. And we actually have two projects that have tried to start to kind of revisit the data and revisit this challenge. And the first has been trying to essentially make a larger island, for one, but also make a larger island in a place where the community, with a setup that the community kind of agrees on. And so we started really a community-driven effort to agree upon a platform that we all like using and a control stack, and try to collect a lot of data, a lot of diverse data with that common platform. And so far, we've brought together 70 people from 18 different Slack organizations and collected more than 38,000 demonstrations in more than 600 scenes. And impressively, this was actually collected across 11 different labs on a common platform using a Franka Mika Panda, a Robotique Gripper, and a single control stack. And we're hoping that hoping to continue to grow this data set, open source it, and have it provide a resource to the community that is allowing us to study generalization with a common robot platform and controlling and standardizing some of the dimensions, but in other dimensions, making the data as diverse as possible. So this is the first effort that we've been working on, and this is still ongoing. And the second effort is trying to actually just use the data that we already have. To do that, we can just put all the data in a common format, train a large model on the data, and see how well the model performs. So that sounds pretty simple, but for this first step is actually a really massive undertaking to try to find all the data sets out there, put them in a format that is kind of similar enough to train models on. And so Quan, who's a researcher at Google, he started an effort to see if, instead of having one person put everything in a common format, started reaching out to people in the community and asked if they would be interested in helping put data that they have into a common format such that everyone in the community could use it. And this led to a pretty large effort that, as of October 8th, had 174 different co-authors from 34 different research labs at 21 different institutions, and led to this aggregated open cross-embodiment data set that spans all the sorts of islands of data that we have, not all of them, but a lot of them, with 1 million different real robot episodes that are mostly demonstrations that span 22 different robot embodiments, 34 different research labs, and more than 300 different scenes. So I think this data set is pretty exciting, and you can actually already download it and sample from it with some fairly straightforward Python code. If you're interested in learning more, you can look at the website. And once we have this data set, we can also start training models on it and see what we can do, what kind of generalization we can get when we train on a much broader data set across institutions. And so to do this, we reused architectures from previous works, specifically the RT1 and RT2 architectures. Both these architectures take as input RGB images from the robot's cameras and a text instruction, and the output corresponds to discretized end effector actions. These architectures are trained with supervised imitation learning. RT2X actually uses a pre-trained vision language model to leverage additional information from the internet. And once we train these models, we can then actually evaluate them at the different institutions where data is collected. And this is a little bit different from a typical evaluation, where in this case, actually training is done in one lab at Google, and then either checkpoints are sent over the internet for the smaller RT1X model, or for the larger RT2X model, actions are actually queried over the internet to actually run the policy on the robots in a number of different other environments, and specifically 6 different other labs. Now, how well does this work? The model was evaluated at 6 different labs and with 6 different robot embodiments. And this is first the RT1X model, the smaller model, and we can see that the RT1X model in the rainbow bar on average outperforms a model that was an RT1X model that was trained only on the data from that embodiment and from that environment. And we also see that it actually outperforms the model that was actually designed for that data set. So first, training on cross-embodiment data is actually improving over using just the in-distribution data, including the method that was originally developed for that data in that lab. And on average, the improvement is actually fairly significant. It's a 20% absolute improvement on average. So that's the RT1X model. If we move to a much larger model that is a pre-trained VLM and then fine-tuned on the open cross-embodiment data, we evaluated it in a number of settings. One experiment that I'll highlight here is evaluating it on novel robot instructions on a Google robot. And these are specifically instructions that are found in the data set for another robot, for a WidowX robot that's actually quite different from the Google robot, and then we evaluated these instructions on the Google robot. This includes things like moving an apple between a can and an orange. And so in the Google robot data, there's data like move the apple near the can, or move the apple near the cup, or pick up the apple, but it never saw instructions of this form of moving it in between 2 objects. And we see that for these kinds of instructions, the RT2X model that's trained on this cross-embodiment data is substantially more effective, up to like more than 50% higher success rate compared to a model that's trained only on Google robot data. And so essentially it's able to transfer information from one robot embodiment to another robot embodiment. Cool. So the takeaway for this first part of the talk is that large scale data is starting to become a reality for robot manipulation, which I think is really exciting. And it means that we can actually start to train models across institutions and and uh, and actually leverage that to enable robots to generalize and actually really deploy them not just at one institution at the lab in which they were trained at, but actually at 6 different institutions and have that model work effectively at those different places. There's also a lot of opportunities for future work. I've been really surprised in both of the 2 efforts that I've mentioned, how eager people are in the community to get involved in efforts like this. And I'm really excited about what the future will hold in terms of the continued expansion of these data sets. And if you're interested in learning more, including some information on access to RT2X, I'd encourage you to come to the Thursday 11 a.m. sponsor talk. There'll be more information on that. So everything so far has been with human teleoperated demonstration data. And I think that this is like, we've been able to make a lot of progress just with that. But the human part of this equation is not particularly scalable. And I think that it's going to be challenging to scale these data sets to the quantity that we might need to really have deployable robots when a human has to control it to collect all the data. And so this raises the question of whether or not we can grow the data that we have through autonomous data collection to cover more and more tasks. And so this is what I'll focus on in the second part of my talk. And specifically, we've been looking at trying to see if we can start with some of the diverse data that we have and then collect data autonomously to expand that data set, and then see if that additional autonomous data is useful by fine-tuning on it with reinforcement learning. And so specifically walking through this process, we're starting with off-the-shelf demonstration data. This is actually demonstration data collected at UC Berkeley, the Bridge V2 data set. And we're going to be trying to actually collect data autonomously at Stanford. So it's not even data that's collected at the same institution. We're also going to start with a pre-trained vision language model. Then we're going to collect a small number of target task demonstrations. And these demonstrations are going to serve the goal of essentially telling the robot what the new task is and helping it explore for that new task. And once we have these target task demonstrations, we're going to combine this with the off-the-shelf pre-training data to get a pre-trained policy and a pre-trained critic for the task, as well as fine-tuning the VLM to be a good reward model to help us ultimately collect some online data. And so once we have our pre-trained policy and our reward model, we can then collect data autonomously using reinforcement learning by essentially fine-tuning the policy that we have with reinforcement learning and this reward model. And then ultimately, if this fine-tuned policy is more successful than without using the online data, that means that that online data, the autonomous data that we collected was actually quite useful. A couple design choices that were quite important for getting this to work. We're going to be learning a language condition policy and critic on all of the data, including the prior data. We're going to be using Mini GPT-4 as our pre-trained VLM, and we're going to fine-tune it to predict binary success or failure as a success criterion for collecting our autonomous data for the target task. We're also going to be using the CalQL algorithm as our kind of base RL algorithm for pre-training and fine-tuning, which we find to be pretty stable and effective even on real robots with diverse data and raw image observations. And lastly, we're also going to be using behavior cloning regularization, which we find to be helpful in terms of stabilizing the approach and also encouraging the policy not to exploit inaccuracies in the reward model. And then the last key design choice that I didn't mention here that I should have mentioned is that we're actually going to be, for the target task, we're actually going to be learning both how to do the target task and how to undo the target task. And this means that this data collection procedure can actually be much more autonomous because the robot can alternate between doing the forward task and then undo the task and then keep on collecting data without a human to intervene to reset the scene. Cool. And so in our real robot experiments, I mentioned that we're using the Bridge V2 data set off the shelf from UC Berkeley, and then we're going to be collecting data for downstream tasks at Stanford, specifically to emphasize the fact that this is fairly easy to do. We're going to actually do this on 5 different real robot tasks: candy sweeping, cloth folding, object covering, putting a lid on a pot, and picking a pot and putting the pot into a dish rack. So let's walk through the process of what this looks like. So we have our prior data. Then we're going to collect some demonstrations for one of the new tasks that we want to collect more autonomous data for. And this will include forward demos for completing the task and some backward demos for undoing the task. And we'll also collect a couple failure demos to help mitigate false positives in our reward function. Then once we collect a small number of demonstration data, that's when we're going to start autonomous data collection. And we're going to run this autonomous data collection process for about 3 hours. And you can see here the robot is trying to both do the task and undo the task so they can keep on autonomously collecting data. And then the question is this autonomous data actually useful for improving a policy for this task? So if you only run behavior cloning on the prior data and the demonstrations, the policy gets 31% success. If you use our offline RL approach without online fine tuning, you get 47% success. And then if you actually incorporate the autonomously collected data, you get a policy that succeeds 66% of the time. And so this means that the autonomous data that we're collecting, the 3 hours of autonomous data, is actually quite useful for improving the success rate by in this case, by 19%. In terms of the other tasks, we also see consistent performance improvements from the autonomously collected data, ranging from a 10% improvement on the pot pick and place task to a 35% improvement on the task of putting a lid on the pot. And so the takeaway here is that essentially the robot can autonomously collect useful data for new tasks by building upon a large and diverse prior data set. Now, in terms of some additional analysis, we can ask if the prior data, the language conditioning, and the online data are important for this process for collecting this autonomous data. And as a reminder, for the candy sweeping task, the performance of the full method is 66%. If you don't include the online data, if you train only on the offline data, then the performance is 47%. If you additionally don't do language conditioning, then the performance of the policy drops down to 13%. And so language conditioning is quite helpful for collecting this data. And then lastly, if you don't use the prior data and try to collect autonomous data from scratch, then the performance of the policy drops down to 23%. And this means that essentially using the prior data and growing the data that we have, starting with the demonstration data and then with autonomous data, is really helpful for getting kind of data that will lead to a successful policy. I showed a number of the real world results. There's also a large number of simulated experiments in the paper. Cool. So the takeaways for all of what I talked about is that first, I think that large scale data is starting to become a reality in robotic manipulation. And second, beyond large scale demonstration data, I think we also now have a path towards actually scaling data collection via robot autonomy. And I think this is really exciting because it means that we might be able to collect a much larger scale data set compared to the human demonstration data that we have already. And overall, I hope that, and I think we're starting to see kind of a paradigm shift where instead of collecting data individually for each project, we can actually start to reuse data like we saw in both of these two projects, including reusing data across institutions to allow our projects to essentially generalize more broadly and also just spend less time collecting data overall. And I think it'd be awesome as a community to figure out how to make something more like the right side to norm so that we can continue to make progress as a community towards solving this really grand challenge of enabling robots to be useful in the real world. With that, I'd love to highlight the students who worked on this. The students who focused on the second part were Jingyun, Max, and Archit, and as well as Brandon, and I'd also be happy to take questions.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. Could you please explain a little bit more about behavior cloning regularization, like how it works, why it improves the performance compared with basic behavior cloning?
Yeah, so we are using behavior cloning regularization just on the policy. So we have a policy and a critic, and we add a term that encourages the policy to predict actions that are similar to those seen in the demonstration data. And so it's only on the demonstration data, not on the autonomously collected data. And this is helpful for a couple reasons. It helps stabilize things a little bit, but also we found that it constrains the policy to perform things that are at least somewhat similar to the demonstrations. And this means that it can't really try out really crazy behaviors that might trip up the reward function. Calibrating the cameras, we're using stereos from the data and so forth. In terms of doing inverse reinforcement learning, I've actually worked a lot on inverse optimal control and inverse RL in the past, and I've always found it really tricky to get reliable reward functions from large scale demonstration data, especially with raw image observations. And so
Or maybe you didn't have really large scale data in the past.
maybe it's worth revisiting with these data sets. But yeah, I've always found it fairly challenging, and simply like supervised classification where you treat the last few states as successes and the other states as failures has always been more stable and easier to do than like an adversarial inverse RL optimization.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. I have a question about, are there any indicators that can tell us how much data is enough data? For example, for the NLP, we might already have a lot of data that is sufficient to have a pretty general purpose NLP models. But the current amount of vision data, I'm not sure, but I don't think it gives us a general purpose vision model that can solve all the vision tasks at the same level as how GPT-4 can solve NLP tasks. For robotics, I think it's one step further. So are there indicators that can tell us how much data is enough data?
Yeah, this is a great question. In some ways, I have no idea how much data is correct. And one thing that could be an indication is you can kind of try to produce scaling law-like things where if you decrease the amount of data relative to what you have and just look at the trend and see what that trend looks like, what does that slope look like? The other thing is I think it's important to continuously push both on data and on algorithms that use that data. And it's possible that possibly with more algorithm development, we'll get algorithms that are a little bit more efficient with data, and that will reduce the amount of data that we need overall. But yeah, it's hard to know, and it certainly seems like what we have right now is a far cry from covering anywhere near the space of what we want it to cover, but it's also really hard to know.
One more question.
So I'm just curious, like, what exactly is language conditioning and why is it helping so much, your RoboFume pipeline?
Yeah, so by language conditioning, I mean that we pass as input a language description of the task to the policy. I can try to bring up a schematic. So it's not exactly this architecture, but as input to the policy, there's a language instruction that's saying like, put the pot in the dish rack, or put the lid on the pod, or sweep the candy, or something like that. And when we don't use language conditioning, we instead condition on a one-hot indicator of the task that says do task 1, task 2, task 3, and so forth. And the language is helpful because it gives you a little bit more structure about it gives you more information about what the task is. So like pick up the pot versus pick up the cabbage are both start with pick up, and that kind of implicitly tells the model that those tasks are related compared to using a one-hot indicator where there's no information about how the different tasks are related.